In this review, I'm going to push back on a narrative here. The narrative that the iPad Pro isn't really Pro, it's just an iPad. That if it could just run Mac OS, it would be a real computer. Will it work for everybody for every single computer task ever? No, of course not. But the Mac isn't that either. So over the last 2 weeks, I've been replacing the tasks that I do on my main computer with my iPad Pro. And I have to say, this device in Apple's ecosystem has come a long, long way over the last few years. Also, hello, I'm Brad. I review tech for creative professionals. When I hear people say that they want an iPad to run Mac OS, what I really hear is that they want a touchscreen Mac. For artists, maybe they want to have the portability and the power of an iPad, but they want to be able to use the Apple Pencil in Photoshop or Illustrator or some other desktop drawing app. Or maybe you enjoy drawing on the iPad, but moving your files from one device to another device all the time is just a workflow bottleneck. I know that illustrators and designers are saying this because I've said this before. So over the last few weeks, I've been trying to replace as many desktop apps as I can with this new iPad Pro. So in this review, I'm not going to be talking about specs as much as I'm going to be talking about user experience, specifically my user experience, trying to use this for as much work as possible. So if I normally use my Mac to capture audio when I record a video, doing that on the iPad. If I'm writing scripts for a video, I'm doing it on the iPad. Laying out my comic, instead of doing it on the desktop, I'm doing it on the iPad. Video editing itself, oh man, that's been a learning curve, but I've been doing it on the iPad. Managing my online courses, doing it on the iPad. Also, discount code for my Learn to Draw in 60 Days course is still in effect. Learn more in the description. So when I've been asking myself the question, can the iPad do this, insert whatever task here, the answer every single time has been yes. Yes, it can. Writing, yeah. Illustration, yeah. Animation, yeah. Video editing, yeah. 3D modeling, yeah. And with a lot of these tasks, the learning curve I was coming up against was much shallower than I thought. It was much easier than I thought. And in other tasks, it was much steeper than I expected. And of course, when you change up a lot of things that you're used to doing one way and you've been doing them that way for a long time, all at once, it's a lot. So I use Premiere Pro for all my video editing. Here I had to jump over to Final Cut. I use Blender for background elements in my comics. I've been using Nomad Sculpt instead. I use Adobe After Effects or Adobe Animate to make little animations for my videos. Here I was using Procreate Dreams or ToonSquid. Just 2 or 3 years ago, many of these jobs were so much harder on the iPad. In fact, I made a video 4 years ago when I tried to use just the iPad for a week, and I absolutely hated it. I just hated it. This time, I did not hate it. It definitely has some bumps. There was definitely a learning curve, but I have seen massive improvements. So let's start with illustration because that's what I do. And this is also an area where the iPad Pro really excels and has for years. There are a ton of great illustration apps out there. Everybody knows Procreate, but there are so many more. Adobe Fresco, Art Studio Pro, Concepts, iBez, Paint X, Clip Studio Paint has an entire desktop app running perfectly on the iPad, has for years. In fact, they've now included a simple mode on the iPad and Android that makes Clip Studio even more streamlined for tablets. It is fantastic. I love Studio Mode. And it's not just illustration apps. Apple has their own mode/app called Sidecar, which turns your iPad into a second screen for your Mac that you can use the Apple Pencil with. It's kind of like a Wacom Cintiq tablet, but it's all working remotely. It's okay. It can be a little laggy at times, depends on your network setup, but for short bursts and editing and tweaking things on the fly, it works pretty well. I think the thing that holds that back from a drawing perspective is that the latency is so good on native iPad drawing apps that when you jump into a situation like that, where you're basically streaming your screen, you can feel it. Now, this new Apple Pencil Pro is great. I love drawing with it. In terms of the drawing experience, it hasn't changed a bit since the original Apple Pencil. The drawing curve feels the same. The level of pressure sensitivity feels the same. You get nice straight lines out of it. It's a great thing to draw with. Now, if you're used to drawing on the desktop and you've never owned an iPad before, one area where you do notice an improvement right away is in drawing lag, because there is virtually none in a lot of the iPad's drawing apps. In fact, this is pretty standard across all iPads. I was comparing this Pro with the Air in a recent Air video, and I did a little camera slowdown thing so you could see the pen lag. If you have to slow down the camera to see this kind of pen lag, it's not really that big a deal. And in general, this is an area where the iPad really excels. What is a big deal is the new barrel squeeze and the haptic feedback that they've added to this new Pencil Pro. Okay, maybe it's not a big deal, but it's nice to have. It's a good addition. We're still a few weeks out from this just coming to the market, so we don't have a ton of apps that are actually supporting some of this stuff yet. I've been playing with some of the betas of like Fresco and Procreate, and it's working well. In some apps, you can squeeze the barrel of the pencil and it brings up a context-sensitive menu. You can also jump onto the iPad settings itself and change this up so your barrel is going to do different things when you squeeze it. For example, if you take a ton of notes and you want to squeeze the barrel and just bring up the Notes app, you can create a shortcut and do that. Now, I did make a mistake in my Air review where I said the barrel squeeze was replacing the double tap that you found in the old Apple Pencil 2. That's where you double tapped on the barrel and it changed tools. The default behavior in most apps was it changed between the brush and the eraser. You could also go into the settings and change those things. I actually went into the settings and just turned that feature off completely because I'm always getting accidental double taps when you just shift around, move around, or change your hand at all. You might accidentally double tap, change to eraser, and you're wondering what's happening here. Why is my brush not working? And then you have to like backtrack and figure it out. Now, in my Air review, I said I was getting some accidental barrel squeezes because I felt the pen shaking. But what was happening was not an accidental barrel squeeze because I was gripping the pen too hard. What was happening were the accidental double taps were still happening, and it was just shaking my pencil. I was getting some haptic feedback back with that double tap. I assumed it was registering a false squeeze, but I like that the double tap also has haptic feedback now. So before, when it switched from my brush to my eraser, I was like, what happened? Why is this all of a sudden not drying? Whereas now I feel something and it's not drawing, and I know that I've accidentally double tapped. I turned it off anyway, but I think it's a great addition. There's also the barrel rotation for app developers to play with here. A lot of people are implementing this in terms of brushes. So if you're drawing in Procreate and you have a long, skinny brush, you can draw wide and then you can tilt it, tilt the pencil, tilt the barrel, roll the barrel, and then draw narrow. I'm also curious to see what other things you're going to see app makers do. I also tested the nano textured iPad screen. That's an optional upgrade for the higher end iPad Pros. Made a whole video on it. My too long didn't read is I don't think it's worth the money for drawing. I was blown away by how good that nano texture looked in direct sunlight, especially when you pair it with that dual OLED display. That thing gets so bright on inside when you're working on it, you don't really notice it that much. When you take it outside, you really do notice it. You add that textured surface to it, you really, really notice it. But for drawing, it feels really smooth. You notice it a little bit. You can hear it when you're drawing with the pencil. So I think some people would like it. But for me, we're talking about a $100 add-on. You can only get it on an iPad that has 1 terabyte and up. So the entry-level price for getting this nano texture on an iPad is $2,000. So if you have a smooth iPad, I'd rate the drawing texture feel like down here, right? If you get a nice screen protector for it, I'd rate it up here. And what you're getting with that nano texture is you're getting a little bump up for a lot of price. You know, you can feel it, it's there, but it's just not worth all that extra money. Your mileage may vary. I've seen a lot of people online playing with this who really love it. So maybe test it out before dropping the cash. I've also been using Affinity Designer a lot on this new iPad. It's a great app. It's a vector app, but it's also what I'm using to lay out my comics and do some word balloons and lettering and things like that. You can also draw on this app. Since I'm working with such huge files, I find the drawing to be a little bit laggy for me. If you're drawing with like smaller files, it's much faster and it works seamlessly with the desktop app too. I can open my files on the iPad, make some edits, send them back to the desktop. Affinity also has a photo editing app, Affinity Photo, as well as a Affinity publishing app, which is similar to InDesign. Affinity Photo is similar to Photoshop. You can draw in it just like you can in Photoshop. You can use different brushes in it. The only reason I don't recommend that is you can also use the same brushes in Affinity Designer, and it just has a lot more drawing tools. So if you're going to purchase just one of those, I would go for Designer, just more art options there. Oh yeah, in the App Store, there's also some slimmed down versions of Photoshop and Illustrator from Adobe on the iPad now. There's also Canva. I don't use Canva. Everything I know about Canva, I've learned from their recent dance video they released, whatever's going on here, but that's available here on the iPad as well. For light graphic design, edits, things you've already created, but you just need to, edit them on the go on the iPad. It's fine for that. It's really good for that. If you're really dedicated, you could do all of your graphic design work here, but I do think you'd have to be really dedicated. The reason I say light work is when I was designing a lot, I would get weird files all the time, or I'd get fonts sent to me. Font management on the iPad, it's possible you can get apps for it and do it that way, but it's just a little bit more cumbersome. One app might recognize your fonts, the other app might not. You might have Adobe fonts, which work in the Adobe apps, but maybe not the other apps. But people would send me PDFs all the time, and on a desktop version, Illustrator can open those up. I can extract logos and assets. It's a lot harder to work with that sort of thing on an iPad. If someone sends you an InDesign file and you're 100% iPad, good luck. It's kind of useless to you. Even if you're sending an Illustrator or Photoshop file, opening those up on the iPad, you're going to lose some of the functionality that the previous designer who is working on them may have used, and that could ruin the files or flatten layers that you don't want flattened. And those are the type of headaches that you're going to run into on the iPad. If you're just doing simple design work where you just need to take your company's logo and put it on a flyer or a website, you could do that. What about animation? This is an area that I think has improved tremendously over the last few years. Procreate Dreams is one of the more high-profile apps released last year for the iPad. They even put on their own Apple-style press conference to show off all the bells and whistles of their new app. Now, I've grown really partial to an app called ToonSquid. Haven't used it a ton, but it just fits my workflow really well. Also, shout out to an app called Calipeg, really good frame-by-frame drawing animation app. And apps like Procreate and Clip Studio have their own animation features built in as well if you just need something lightweight to make some quick animations. Now, 3 years ago, when I tried to move some of my animation workflow to the iPad, it failed pretty hard. Now, I can totally do it. Now, keep in mind, the animation that I do is pretty darn crude compared to what real pros out there are doing. I'm doing like simple frame-by-frame animations. I can do that. Just stuff that I want to stick into a video. Shaky text. What I normally use is Adobe Animate. I can import audio files into that. I can create symbols. I can reuse characters, poses, backgrounds. I can use tweening animation to move elements across the stage, save a lot of time. I can also loop those clips. I just couldn't do that kind of stuff on the iPad before. Now I can. Procreate Dreams and ToonSquid do all of those things really well. I do get lost in Dream's timeline a little bit, which is why I tend to gravitate more towards ToonSquid, but they are doing some really cool stuff here that I think a lot of people love. For example, you could zoom in on just one part of the timeline in Dreams and just play that chunk. It's gonna loop over and over again. And a lot of other animation apps, you have to move the playhead back, play that part, move the playhead back, play that part. Dreams is full of little innovations like that, and it's one of the few apps that's really taking advantage of the M4 processor, using Gaussian blur in a non-destructive way, and all sorts of other animation features in there that are really, really cool. I can make a 10-minute educational animated YouTube video here on the iPad right now. And that's great. That is a huge step forward. If you're just learning animation, I don't think the iPad is a bad place to start grinding out your skills. But will professional animation companies start using the iPad for production the way professional illustrators do? No, I don't think so, at least not right now. I can see some parts of the process going to the iPad. For example, if you're a storyboarder and you just need to storyboard out something quickly, Procreate Dreams might be perfect for you. Maybe you need to like put together a quick animatic with some audio on it. It's great for that. But in terms of working on a team, collaborating, sharing your stuff, the iPad still isn't quite there yet. Then there are 3D apps. Now, one app I really need to spend more time with is one called Nomad Sculpt. This is a 3D rendering / modeling app, and it's really super easy to use, surprisingly easy to use. Maybe it just seems easier because I'm used to Blender, it's got a bit of a learning curve. Now, I don't use Blender to its fullest. I don't do everything that app can do. It can do a lot. I maybe use 10% of Blender. This was the one place where I felt like the iPad experience was easier and faster than doing it on the desktop. I was pleasantly surprised. Now, if you are a hardcore 3D person, your experience may vary from mine, but in general, this was fun. And yes, shout out to everybody in the comments who basically have been shaming me into trying this app for the longest time. I take full responsibility for not listening to you all sooner. There will definitely be some Nomad Sculpt videos coming to this channel in the future. So if you're looking to get into 3D on your iPad in the near future, subscribe so you don't miss that. There are also other 3D apps coming out soon, most notably ZBrush. This is one that Apple has been showing off ahead of release. So watch this space, 3D modeling on the iPad. It's growing up. Okay, let's talk about video editing, because this was a little bit more of a learning curve for me. This was one of the pain points. Now, as I mentioned before, I was jumping from Adobe Premiere on the desktop to Final Cut here. So it wasn't just that I was trying to do it on a new platform. I was also trying to learn a completely different app. And I think that really added to my frustration. And to be fair, there's a lot of people who use Final Cut as their main video editing tool. And if you're one of those people, you're probably going to have a lot less to learn than I did. For example, for me, the magnetic timeline in Final Cut, oh my gosh, that thing just killed me. I did a lot of Googling to figure out how to turn that off. I found lots of people telling me how to do it on the desktop, not many for the iPad. If you know, let me know down below in the comments. Anyway, my original plan was just to use the iPad for video editing for an entire week. So I started that with my iPad Air review. I started editing there. I ended up bailing about 2 days in because I just needed to get the video out. I will say, overall, video editing went way smoother this time than it did last time, a few years back, when I tried doing the same thing with LumaFusion. And I think that's partially because of the file system. It's just come a long way. The Files app back then was missing some of the core features you'd expect from any Files app, file system. You couldn't see the progress of the files you were transferring over. Now you can. So if you're moving a big file from your SD card, something you filmed on your camera, it's way smoother. Before, you just kind of had to guess when those big files were done transferring over. That caused some headaches. So if I was going to do video editing full time, I would definitely invest in a dock that you could kind of plug into your iPad, something with more ports, USB ports, an SD card reader. Now, you Final Cut people out there who love your app, I get it, I understand. And there were some things there that I grew to love over time. The iPad has this little dial so you can hone in very precisely on the clip you're selecting. So if you want to cut it off, you could do that really easily. Also, the way that it interfaced with the Apple Pencil I thought was a lot of fun. Ultimately, I cut my video editing experiment a little bit short because it was just moving too dang slow. I've grown reliant on plugins and shortcuts and Premiere Pro, and I just wanted to use those. I did take my iPad Air review, what I had of it, and I exported it, and I also exported something similar on my desktop, and I found the iPad to export 4K video at a pretty decent clip. So this is all to say, if you're used to using Final Cut, or even something like DaVinci Resolve, which is also on the iPad, your experience is probably going to be a lot smoother than mine. Let's talk more about this file system that I mentioned a minute ago. This is something that is often pilloried in iPad reviews, but all the features of a modern file system exist on the iPad today. But there's some stuff going on under the hood of the iPad itself that makes it feel less useful than you might think it should be. Let's put it this way. The iPad to me feels siloed. You can multitask by splitting windows across your screen. You could use the Stage Manager feature that rolled out a few years ago. That one's never quite warmed up on me. But the iPad is really designed to have one app open at a time with all of your focus, funneled towards that app. And because of that, many apps are designed to take care of some of the file management for you. And as a pro, I work with a lot of files, JPEGs, PSDs, PDFs, MP4 files. On the iPad, I have to move my files from one ecosystem to another ecosystem. On a desktop computer, I have a folder. I double click on the file. It just opens in the right app. Here, I have to share a file into Procreate or share it into something else. And sometimes it's not on the default list, so you have to go scrolling through all your apps to say, send it here. And then what ends up happening in a lot of these apps is the file lives in two places. It lives in your file system, but it also lives in the app where you were last using it and editing it. So there's this constant push and pull the file back in, and you're having to get the right file in the right place. And is the correct file, most recent file in the app, or is it in the file system? And do I need to push it over to that file system? Even in Affinity Designer, where my files are stored in Dropbox and I can just save it and it's going to upload to Dropbox, I still had to go and manually pull down the most recent Dropbox file. It wasn't like an automated thing. Some apps it is, some apps it's not. And the iPad OS itself treats different files differently. Like if I download a PSD from the web, or if I airdrop it to myself, the default action the iPad wants to take is it wants to flatten that image like a JPEG and throw it in the Photos app, not into a Files app. Other files, like if you download a font, for example, it will go into the Downloads folder. And when you're trying to create something that involves a lot of different assets, whether that's a design or a video, that lack of consistency across the iPad OS and across apps in general just gives you more things to juggle. Oh, I can't airdrop that kind of file. These files I need to cloud save and import. I need to remember to export this file before I can import it into that other app. My workflow on the iPad had this extra layer of mental management I had to do that just doesn't exist on the desktop. This section I'm calling Things I Missed when I was working on the iPad. I really missed being able to open more than one Google document at a time. I always have a handful of Google Docs open at any given time. I write video scripts in spurts and just in chunks. So usually I have like 3 to 5 videos in progress. I'm reviewing multiple things at once. Use a product, have a thought, write it down, then I go back to whatever else I was doing. I tried to use Google Docs in Safari and I would tap on a document, but instead of opening it in a new tab like it does on the desktop, it would open it in the app. The app can only have one document open at a time. It also has this other quirk where before you can actually start editing the document, you have to hit the edit button. So what I was doing is I was always tapping a document, forgetting that it was going to open in the app, going back to Safari, long pressing on it, saying open a new tab, then go to the tab and editing the document. In and of itself, these sort of things aren't really a big deal. It's just something to work around. But when you start adding up those experiences, they really pile up and they really slow you down. Also, Google Docs on the iPad just flat out sucks. I don't know if Google is intentionally holding it back because it's an Apple thing or not, but not a fan. I also really missed having a headphone jack on the iPad. Yes, I have wireless headphones, but wireless gear requires you to charge it. And this is just another task that I had to manage, was keeping the batteries charged in my headphones at all times. That's something that doesn't happen on a laptop or a computer. Another thing, if one more app ask me to rate it, I'm gonna lose my mind. This just doesn't happen on the desktop. That's not true. Adobe asks you to rate it once in a while. This happens so often on the iPad. I think it's probably because I was setting up an iPad and I was also testing multiple iPads. I had 2 iPad Pros at one point. I had the iPad Air. I had set them all up. I was loading new apps on them. I was testing things out, and I'm just constantly bombarded with this radar app, an absolute productivity killer, and it just feels so unprofessional. Like, if you're trying to get things done, I don't know if there's anything Apple can do about this, but it would be nice if an app could only ask you one time and then never ask again. Hell, I would pay a couple bucks a month to like remove annoying features from app on a universal level. Like, give me the true pro version of the iPad that takes that feature away. So I'm ending this video kind of on negative notes because I'm listing some of the things that annoyed me. But in general, my experience with the iPads were really good. And I think my takeaway is, for some people, not everybody, the iPad could be your main computer, a computer replacement instead of just a side device, the way I tend to use my iPad. I still think for most illustrators, most designers, most creative pros, the iPad Pro is an accessory, not the main tool you're going to use. Even if you are an illustrator drawing on your iPad for 8 hours a day, you're probably going to still want a laptop to move files over to. And that's okay. A lot of pros don't mind paying good money for a killer accessory that really helps them out. If you want this to be your main computer, do know that there is a ramp up. There is a learning curve. There's a lot that you're going to have to overcome, especially if you have years of like built-in muscle memory using desktop applications. You can do these things on the iPad, and it's amazing how far the iPad has come in 4 years. 4 years feels like a long time, but if you stop and think about all of the apps that have come out in the last 4 years, where are we going to be in 4 more years or 8 more years? But what do you think? Let me know down below in the comments. Thank you all for watching this video, and I'll talk to you in a couple of days.